Bandwidth for This Week in Mad Men provided by liquidweb.com.
Tonight on This Week in Mad Men, Betty's on Weight Watchers, Manischewitz makes a wine for normal people, and Ginsberg doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell. So have your lawyer call our lawyer, because it's time for a new This Week in Mad Men. Hello, everybody out there. Welcome to another new episode of This Week in Mad Men. It's the show that talks about what happened this week in Mad Men. It's fairly self-explanatory. We got a great episode. It's called Dark Shadows to talk about. But first, introducing our panel. I, as always, am your host, Lon Harris. Joining me, as always, my co-host, our co-panelist, Ms. Janie Haddad Tompkins. And joining us for the first time, Jamie Foxx, not with us tonight. Instead, we have a very special guest from one of my favorite TV shows of all time, Mystery Science Theater 3000. He was a writer on that show. You may remember him as TV's Frank. He appeared on that show. Currently appearing on The Jimmy Dore Show. He hosts Cartoon Dump at the Steve Allen Theater if you're here in LA. And he still performs with MST3K vets as Cinematic Titanic. Please welcome Mr. Frank Conniff.
Hey.
Yay. Frank, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's a delight to have you here. So we always open, we'll just talk a little bit about just general thoughts. I'll tell you, I sort of felt like after 5-6 weeks of just solid, and we were talking last week about how many great episodes in a row this season has had. We were on this amazing 5-week run. I feel like this was still a good episode, but it was less intense and maybe sort of it came together less brilliantly than the last few weeks of episodes. I felt like it was nice to see Fat Betty come back, and I think this was better than the first Fat Betty.
Also, Fat Betty.
Fat Betty's good. That's my spin-off. We're gonna do the Fat Betty spin-off.
America Ferrara, right?
Yeah.
Yes, fat and ugly and fat.
No,
Betty.
it'll be North America Ferrara.
Yes, she's extremely huge.
That's why she's Fat Betty.
Right. But what did you guys think of this week? I mean, is it as good as we've seen this season? Better? Give me some thoughts.
I would say I agree, not as good as some of the other episodes, but that only speaks to the high quality of the other episodes. It was still a pretty great episode, I thought, and it was very compelling all the way through. And but I think some of the other ones were even greater. So that's the only reason I would say that it wasn't up to that. But it was it was definitely up to the standards of the show, I would say.
Yeah, it's been an amazing run this season. It's sort of inevitable that it couldn't last forever.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And while it wasn't as splashy as some of the previous ones this season with that run in the center, and I really thought it was great, and I enjoyed sort of the emotional topics that they dealt with.
Yeah.
With the
I mean, we're getting, there's so much depth this season. We're really unraveling a lot, unpacking a lot about these characters. And one thing that this week sort of made me think of, and I have this somewhere in my notes, but I'll bring it up now, is I feel like we are getting, at this point, this sort of godlike perspective. I mean, we're seeing so much about every individual character. In some ways, it's like we know them better than they know themselves.
Well, every single character in this episode felt envy or covetousness of some kind. And there wasn't one character that was overlooked in that department. In fact, the godlike point is a good one. I thought it was almost biblical with the thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And here we have Pete literally coveting his neighbor's wife, and we have Betty literally coveting this woman's husband in life, you know, and it wasn't subtle in that regard, but I still appreciated it.
Yeah, it was subtle in the sense that as far as Betty goes, you know, she is so wicked in so many ways. Like, she is a really harsh character, and that's what's so great about her, I think. And here she was just with great ease, just lobbing a bomb, and after she goes to the house and sees how nice it is and sees how thin the new wife is and how great it all is, and her just like lobbing this bomb into the household, no concern by how much it's going to screw up Sally, you know, just to get back at Don.
Yeah,
you know.
This is the first time I actually thought borderline personality disorder. I mean, is that a stretch? Did anyone sort of?
No, I think definitely we're now getting to the point where And there's that line where the Weight Watchers woman is saying, you've got to fill that space. You're filling it with food. You've got to fill it with family, with friends, with your house, with your loved ones. And I think that we're now getting this idea of Betty where she's just got this hole and nothing. We always seem to get the promise that something's going to fill it.
The family and the home and the house isn't giving her nourishment.
It doesn't. It doesn't do it for her, and she doesn't seem to have any desire to have a career. And what career would she really have? She was a model before she met Don.
Well, that's another contrast between her and Megan.
Right.
Is that there was that episode a few seasons ago where someone wanted Betty to model something, and she was all excited about it, and it kind of brought her back to her early days before she met Don, or when she met Don, and he put the kibosh on it, and Betty is still, as does Don, comes from that traditional 50s world more, and for women especially. They were given a specific role that they were supposed to play, and any deviation from that was considered crazy. But now we're like in 1966, where women like Megan are actually have the idea, I can be fulfilled other than being a wife and a mother.
And Peggy, we've seen that same thing play
and
out.
Peggy.
Even Dawn in some ways this season. Not Dawn. Dawn, the secretary.
Yeah. Were you surprised by Don Draper's acceptance of Megan sort of branching out and following her?
You know what? It surprises me in some ways, but I think that, and I think that might be what's coming up in future episodes, is underneath it, I think he's not happy with it at all.
I agree with you. On the last episode, I was predicting that this is going to be her journey is going to be very avant-garde because she is studying in the mid-60s, when all that Udo Hagen stuff was going.
You were talking about that last week, and then right away, boom, we get an episode that works in how her acting training is affecting their home life. I love the scene with her teaching Sally. A lot of this episode, just to take a big step back, I think was about Sally. This whole season has been learning a lot of the world of adults.
Right.
The codfish ball episode where she sees Roger and Marie together. We'll say together. It's polite. It's a family show. And then this week she learns from Megan how to make it look like she's crying. So how to manipulate. And then she also learns how to basically be cruel. She learns how to torment her mother.
Well, she learns that people manipulate.
That people are manipulated, but she figures out, because she's extremely perceptive for her age, that it really matters to her mom that Megan get upset about Anna Draper. And so when she has this opportunity to really put the screws to her, like, oh no, they showed me photos. They were super happy.
Did you think that scene was really unsettling? Because it made me so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think all of Sally in this episode was, she's really becoming cruel and, like her mother in some ways, cruel, vindictive, angry. And she knew exactly what to say to Megan to piss her off, to be like, you're just Don's pawn.
Well, she undermined her.
Yeah, you're just his pawn. You're going to go fake cry.
Yeah.
And then she does the same thing to her mother. And so we're really seeing now, we've been talking for seasons about how all this deplorable behavior is going to impact poor young Sally. And now we're starting to really see it.
And also Sally seems to be smart enough to know what her limits are in terms of how far she can take her adult-like behavior. So in other words, when Don berates her and tells her to apologize to Megan, she kind of knows, okay, this is where I have to step back a bit. But she's still holding all those resentments inside her. And it's not like they're going away or anything. But it's like you said, she's really learning about the adult world, and she's learning how to be an adult in not the best way.
Well, she's got these horrible role models that are showing how to be duplicitous and how to be manipulative.
Sexual.
And how just like these power plays and this constant war for control she sees playing out in front of her, both Betty and Don and Megan and Don. There's, I think jealous rivalries, as you were saying, is sort of the big theme of this whole episode. And what I thought was interesting was it's not it's at work, it's at home. It's really saying all of these groups and all these relationships that are supposed to be a team, a unit working together, it's really, if you look at it, all people trying to one-up one another.
Constant resentment and competition.
Yeah, and Don makes that point to Ginsberg. Ginsberg's like, you didn't even pitch my idea. And Don's like, well, we've got the account. That's what matters. And like they say, because Pete earlier this season was, we're a family. Sterling Cooper's a family. But in this episode, Roger actually has the line, it's every man for himself.
Yeah.
And that really is what I think this whole episode came down to, is even the family unit, it's really Megan versus Sally, Betty versus Don, Betty versus 100%.
Megan. It was that was like the worldview that was coming out, and either you frame your own happiness. And maybe it's faking it until you make it, like Betty at the end, you know, or just not letting it come near you, like Megan, like don't let the toxicity in the room, you know. But it basically is like
Megan,
it's up to you.
And that brings up the scene where she's running lines with her actress friend.
Yeah, Julia.
And she says,
yeah.
And Megan is very like kind of condescending towards the script, and this is just trash, and it's kind of. It kind of shows that, you know, she doesn't even really quite know the real world. She's an actress, but she doesn't quite know the real world of it, because she is, like her friend said, she is sheltered and she has it very good and she's very lucky, you know. So it's kind of like her journey of self-actualization that she's going through is being made easier for her by Don, but I think that's where conflict is going to come from, because Don is all about not having, he's run away from self-actualization to the point where he's created a new identity for himself. You know, he's the opposite of that. He doesn't want to, he's figured out the role that he wants to present to the world in life, but he doesn't, in last season he had a chance to go closer to who he really was when he had that woman that he was with before he surprisingly married. Megan,
Faye, Dr. Faye.
Who said, you know, go ahead and let people know all your secrets. I'll be with you. You know, we'll be in this together, and you'll become who you are. And that like scared the crap out of him. He couldn't deal with that. He had to be with Megan, who could more prop up his
reinforce
the image that he's the self-invention that he's made of himself.
Yeah, and actually, Chubby Werewolf in our chat room brought up an excellent point. Chat room regular.
He's good.
He actually was tying this episode to The Summer Man, which you guys remember was the episode where Don is sort of realizing he's maybe sort of bottomed out as an alcoholic and is starting to physically reduce, like I'm going to drink less. He has that he's in the swimming pool at the athletic club. And so in that episode, it was about this physical renewal he was going through that he sort of succeeded by. And in this episode, he's sort of trying to do the same thing, more like a creative renewal, but it ends up not really being much of self-actualization, because he ends up ditching, like throwing this other guy on the bus.
It's almost like too late, too little too late or something.
Well, and it's sort of cheating on both ends. He looked at Ginsberg's work and got his ideas from looking at what this other guy was doing with it, and then he tosses the other guy's work out so that his idea gets up first, even though Pete definitely was immediately like, Ginsberg's is better, and I think as a viewer, you were definitely supposed to think Ginsberg's is better.
Yeah, it was
the devil one is just weird and a little
convoluted.
Ginsberg
is presented as a very unique and a very creative person, and a person, you know, Don is talented, but Ginsberg has this kind of almost incendiary kind of talent where he rubs people the wrong way.
Yeah.
You know, he's very, like there was a scene he sat in Roger Sterling's seat.
Yeah.
Remember that when he brought him in?
Yeah.
You know, he doesn't have the social graces. But he's there mainly because he's really, they know that he's really talented.
He's a whiz kid.
And he can help them, but he doesn't quite fit into that world. And also anyone, any writer can, even though they have a point in saying, well, we made the sale, because that is what it's all about ultimately, but any writer can totally relate to Ginsberg being completely angry that they didn't even show his
all the
thing.
work he put into
all the work and that scene where he says to Don, I feel bad for you, and Don says, I don't even think of you at all. I mean, that it's amazing how dickish Don Draper can be. You know? I mean, we haven't seen as much of that. We've seen it in terms of his relationship with his new wife, but in The Office, because of her, when she was there, he had kind of little softer, and people like Ginsberg and Peggy are like standing up to him like they never did in previous seasons.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, and that was what was interesting, I think, about Don's pitch, is that they're all receiving it like, oh, this is great, and we know they wouldn't just blow smoke. They must have really liked it.
I have a question about that because as a writer, when he pitched that, I mean, as soon as the Snowball's Chance in Hell came out, it was obviously a cliche, which is like the #1 rule of like bad writing.
Right.
And the fact that they were all saying, that's good. I thought they were sort of...
I mean, they could have been placating him because he so rarely was pitching his own ideas or his own writing at this point that when he does, you feel like you don't want to be like, nah, that sucks. Go back to just telling us what to do.
And then in the original drawing that he saw at night, it was of Hitler being hit in the face.
Right, with the snowball.
Yeah.
And I loved the scene, too, while we're talking about his snowball pitch, where he's talking into the dictaphone, and it's just nonsense. I mean, it's just... Because in season 1, if you remember back to when we first met this character, everything he came up with was like a nugget of genius. The whole show was just like his every idea, as soon as he gets the idea, is just brilliant right off the bat. And to see him brainstorming, and it's so inane, like, they're sinfully delicious, and it's just... And he likes it.
He's rattled by this youth counterculture.
Right, and also, because the world is changing, and that's the thing, is he built himself up to function in the world that starting in the mid-60s and in the years to come wasn't going to exist anymore. You know, it was the whole world was about to change. And he had made himself successful in the previous world, so now I think it's a little awkward for him
know how to
fit in. It's there in an earlier episode. Rogers Serling said, "When is everything going to be normal again?"
Yeah,
you know?
It never does. Never goes back.
And it's not. And in the previous seasons, no matter what was going on in Don's life, he was always just the master at work. Like nobody could ever, and he always could save meetings. And I remember, I love that scene from a few years ago where that character Duck was trying to undermine him and sell the company or whatever, and he had his whole meeting where he was going to really eviscerate Don, and then Don just wiped the floor with him.
Just flips it completely around on him.
And I love seeing him being in control like that at work. And I also, you know, as a writer who's worked in, you know, on television shows in those kind of work situations, those scenes are always very compelling to me, of just them putting together the pitch and brainstorming and things like that. You know, they could do the whole show at the office, and I'd probably still like it.
And early episodes were more, I think, like that, where you'd follow one account from the beginning and the end to see how they developed it.
He's rattled by the young writers when he looks at all their names on the, you know, and he sees the Hitler pitch or whatever.
Well, he's going through the portfolio, he sees Ginsberg, how much Ginsberg has done.
And then we hear Sterling on the phone, and he's like, well, the reason you don't perform well in front of a professional is because the stakes are high, or something like that. You always win golf against me because I suck at it, or whatever. And it's like, well, he doesn't perform as well because he's surrounded by all this incredible talent that he's gathered to him now.
It's like in TV terms, he's moved from writer to showrunner, kind of. You know?
Well,
and he misses being there.
He misses being because I think that it's not that that his talent is going to go away, but he is in danger of not standing out as much anymore. You know, because Ginsberg could come in with a really brilliant thing, and Peggy can, and Don still can, obviously, but it used to be it was just Don that always came up with the
they're going to get all
ideas.
those awards that he supposedly didn't care about.
And I think part of this, too, does link up with Megan, who he saw as sort of an extension of himself. He taught her, he trained her, she has his last name. She was coming along, and she was the new young genius who came up with the beans on the moon pitch.
And also, though, and I just thought of this just now, is that, and how it relates to what we're talking about, is that in that episode, which I think was even the last episode, where she quit the advertising agency, and Don was so comfortable with her being creative yet playing the role of like being at the dinner and letting Don take all the credit. And you know, in the taxi cab, he was going to make love to her and say, "You were so brilliant, you were so great, you're amazing." But in the world of the workplace, he was very comfortable with taking all the credit for it.
And having her play the role of the wife of the
Now, I would be remiss if to not mention, because we were talking about the snow cone pitch in Don's office, I would be remiss if I did not mention or ask, why do kids hate Indian chiefs?
If you remember the films at the time. I mean, it is funny. It is funny in a modern context, but if you remember the films at the time,
remind me, what are you referring to?
Well, he says that they're all going to hit someone in the face that kids don't like with a snowball. And he's like, you know, teachers, businessmen, cops, Indian chiefs.
Well,
that cowboy movies.
Cowboy movies.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Before
it made me laugh.
Before Star Wars, which is a Western in outer space, basically. Westerns were the big things for kids, and Indians were always the bad guys.
They were the evil.
And this was actually 1966 was still a couple years before the whole consciousness of the way we treated Indians and how
it was the 70s was when you got like Little Big Man, and all of a sudden it's more of this revisionist, you know.
And the Indian crying over litter. Remember that?
Yes, that was the 80s, I think.
No, that was 70s.
Was that 70s?
Yeah, that was around for a long time.
Yeah. And then randomly a pig. Why a pig? Because it makes people laugh. But I like that Ginsberg has that kind of sensibility. If it doesn't all have to be totally thought through, it gets the reaction.
Yeah, he's great, and also I think that the inspiration for the Manischewitz thing, where he comes up with the bus idea, and I grew up in New York, and I remember on buses and on posters everywhere, and people all over the country saw these commercials on TV where it was an iconic ad campaign for a Hebrew National rye bread, and the line was, "You don't have to be Jewish to love Hebrew National," and there'd be a picture of an Indian, there'd be a picture of an Eskimo, there'd be a picture of all people from all different walks of life.
Interesting.
And it was a very simple. And I thought of that when he said, because I used to see that ad on buses, and I think, you know, Manischewitz was just their way of riffing on that
nodding to that
Hebrew National campaign.
It was intentional from Matthew Weiner. I mean,
absolutely.
He's so
and
thorough from that's why we have you here, Frank.
Yes.
He grew up in Manhattan in that era.
At exactly the time the show takes place.
I thought that was an interesting tie in that ad to another big theme or sort of setting of the episode, which is to talk about, which is Thanksgiving. The episode absolutely is happening over Thanksgiving, and just the idea of all of these different races and nationalities coming together to enjoy the food of one of them does sort of speak to the Thanksgiving
sort of the
holiday.
nod to Native Americans and how we
the Indian chief we already mentioned, and just this idea too of, we were already talking about the rivalry competitive theme of being so. The nature of Thanksgiving is it's about white people and Indians getting together and sharing a meal before they spend.
But I like though that Thanksgiving was an element of the episode, but it wasn't a Thanksgiving episode. You know what I mean? Because that's what every show does, is the Thanksgiving becomes the center of it, and then the dinner where everybody goes crazy. Because that comes from real life and everybody relates to it. And you can understand why they do that scene. But they kind of avoided that. They just showed you the beginning. They didn't even show Don's dinner. They just showed
you see the Francis family, and you see Megan sort of cooking, and Don is still asleep, and she's pouring the disgusting cranberry sauce from the jar out of the dish.
Where was Henry's mom? Remember a few seasons back? Pauline was at, remember their first Thanksgiving together.
I wonder if her ankle, she still hurt her ankle?
Maybe.
She's still recovering?
But their first Thanksgiving together, she was a little sassy toward Sally.
Oh, yeah,
she didn't want to eat the yams.
You're right, yeah.
And so I was like, oh, do they go to her house later, maybe? They hit Pauline's
They
after
must
their,
have. They must have done something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was very interesting to have a Thanksgiving. The whole episode is about everybody coveting each other, everybody being so focused outward, and then the episode ends with this holiday that's supposed to be about counting what you have and your blessings.
Being happy with what you have, or
just
being thankful for what you have.
Even just appreciating or recognizing what you have.
It's the contrast.
Yeah, and that was a brilliant image at the end, in that she, Betty eating her tiny little portion.
She has one Brussels sprout, and then
all the gratitude, none of it is filling her up. You know, it's like so unsubstantial. She's so empty.
She's so empty.
And then it ends with her basically lying. She says, "I'm so thankful for everything I have, and that no one has anything better," which you can tell in her crazy, twisted mind sounded sweet.
I think
nobody could have a better family, but in this weird way is sort of laying bare.
She's very unhappy in that.
Right.
I thought she was sort of faking it till she made it. I thought she actually was saying that to attempt to convince herself.
Like, well, right. I think, and actually I have in my notes.
She wasn't lying to herself.
I think I have in my notes lying as self-delusion.
Lying as self-delusion.
Is what, because that's to me what she's doing. Don does the same thing when he tells Ginsberg, I don't think about you at all, because we know, of course, he does constantly.
There was another lie I want to ask you guys about.
Sure.
Did you believe Roger Sterling?
Couldn't have done it better myself. That was right where I was going.
You and I, simpatico,
right
baby.
There, right
simpatico.
there.
Which part?
When Roger Sterling, he takes his ex-wife in her brand new apartment, and she's upset the next day because she feels he has now tainted her new start. And she is jealous of him because he can do whatever he wants without impunity, and she is stuck in this world depending on his money and all this stuff.
And her line is, you get everything you want and you still had to do this.
Yeah, and he says, you're right, I feel horrible. And he walks out. Now, was he being genuine? Did he truly feel horrible? Does he have the capacity to feel horrible about what he did?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
Really.
I agree with you, Frank.
I don't. I agree with you. He's a very, he's this like incredibly privileged person without a lot of talent, with charm, this fake charm that he puts on every people.
He's a charming narcissist.
He can buy his soon-to-be divorced wife an apartment, you know? And he always has a huge wad of cash in his, and he has.
And I like that he says, I gotta stop bringing her out so much money with you, but he never does. He always
well,
has
that's the era too. That even though credit cards were around back then, they were.
ATMs,
every people who had money had it on them, you know.
Yeah.
So in cash, and so I don't think I think he feels really good that he got out of, that he used the acid trip as his way out of.
He thinks he dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
It was clean.
And
I totally agree. I don't think he's being sincere that he really feels sorry for her. I think he now, whereas in a previous season he probably would have quipped and walked off whistling, he now has the presence of mind to realize, I should be sensitive.
Yeah.
I should say I'm sorry and be delicate and then.
I need to say something here to look
right. But I think it was more the right answer.
Because if he was more like the person he's trying to present, it would be their making love in the new apartment might have been a rekindling. It might have been, I made a mistake. We should stay together. But he was just using her.
Yeah, he just wanted it.
There was nothing more to it than that.
I think is interesting, and I'd like to unpack. Why do you think what's going through his head? Why he just because he can, just because she's there?
He was made jealous
because the
young man.
Rosenberg's son was hitting on her at the dinner.
Again, we see every character experiencing envy or covetousness, and he's like, "Are you gonna go to his place now?" And she's like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Well, you should tell her that we're still. You should tell him we're still married." Because so to me. He would have dropped her off after that dinner if that man had not flirted with Jane in front of him. And it was all jealousy. He was motivated by his envy.
And he was saying to her that his concern was for the account, but it was more than that.
This was
ego. Yeah.
This was a convenient way to get back in there.
I think we are all in agreement that he wasn't being sincere, and I think
there's nothing in his past behavior that would indicate that.
And even in this episode, I think his worldview is definitely summed up in that elevator conversation with Peggy. Like it's survival of the fittest. It's every man.
I think the biggest thing to me is he seemed genuinely delighted in the last few weeks to be free of this thing. Like it's the best thing that he did was take acid and then use that as his way to get out.
He talks about the acid all the time.
He talks about it constantly, and it was clearly a huge plus for him to be able to use that. So I don't think there's any chance he would. To feel bad for her would be almost to be back in that place of considering her and worrying about what she's going to do, and he's over that.
Yeah.
And plus, she should be happy that she has that great apartment.
It's a nice apartment.
And she's young and beautiful.
I look at like New York, Manhattan real estate like porn.
Oh my God! So does Betty apparently.
Yeah, so a great apartment in Manhattan.
And then I loved Bobby.
Pretty great.
The Draper apartment.
Bobby too. This week when they're going around at the very end, and Bobby's what's he thankful for? He says
his material goods.
He has two houses and they're both really big, and I think that's interesting that it brings around to. People being sad or depressed in beautiful spaces was a lot. There was a lot of that this week.
It struck me that it was such a purely materialistic
Yeah, well, right, for a little
wish.
boy, too, that it seems like the house would be the thing he's fixated on, not toys.
But then
or
I thought,
TV
well, he's
or...
a kid, and I don't have kids, so I don't know if that's like a phase.
And also, in terms
to
of the divorce, you know, it's, you know, in terms of the parents winning favor with the kids, it seems to me there's no contest between Betty and Don. You know, the kids enjoy going into Manhattan. And,
Megan's fun.
Megan is fun.
She's a great stepmom.
And he is, and Don is kind of like a absentee father, even when he's there, kind of. You know, although, you know, Sally does bring him to the brink sometimes, but so Betty, you know, that's another dynamic with Betty, I think, is that the kids, even though they're obviously traumatized by the divorce, I think they enjoy it when they get to go to stay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they seem sort of always kind of sorry to have to leave Don and Megan's when Betty comes and is waiting by the door for them.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about, while we were talking about Bobby, and the chat room egged me on, because I was 50-50 about whether to even bring this up. The odd symbolism of Bobby's drawing. Betty even sort of has a withering comment about it. It's a smiling, happy whale with 3 like harpoons in his side.
Well,
and Betty very dismissively like, well, I don't know why he would be smiling.
Well,
what do you think is any significance to that at all, aside from setting up Betty's
I thought they
comment?
were talking about Fat Betty in that picture because
she's a whale.
Yeah, because
with
earlier
3 thorns in her
he
side
said
or her children.
the whale shouldn't be smiling because she's not smiling. But
right,
then she said, earlier he was like, she sticks her fat nose in everywhere.
Yeah,
she's in the Weight Watch. I just thought they were being like.
Well, Don makes the fat nose and everything comment to Megan, so it could be that he knows.
And another thing is
Megan's going to be open to fat comments about his ex-wife.
Oh, you think that he was hoping they'd go on a fat comment rate?
Well, no, I'm thinking it is possible that in their dynamic, Don makes fat jokes about Betty to Megan to boost her
Megan's
up.
above that, though. Megan's above it.
Yeah, but you know what though, as far as the kid,
she likes bashing Betty, you know, whenever the opportunity.
As far as the whale picture, though, I think if it was about his mom, it would be a very subconscious thing, I think, because I don't think kids think about, like, I don't think a kid notices, and Betty isn't even, I mean, she's overweight, but it's not like
her fat suit has reduced.
Yeah, no, she looks slimmer this time than the last time we saw Fat Betty.
She's, you know, so I don't think kids necessarily think, oh, mommy used to be hot and now she's fat.
So he was just drawing a whale,
but it might have been a subconscious thing or something, but I don't think he would consciously.
Yeah. I thought it was very
I meant subconscious. I meant subconscious because I mean there is no way.
Anytime they make a point of displaying something in front of the camera, I feel like this is a message to me and that I should bring it up on this show. But
we are trained
the
to
3
look
thorns
at
at the side and then the 3 children does seem like that's sort
a little bit
purposeful in some way, and that people are pointing out in the chat room the most famous male, the most famous whale would be Moby Dick. Dick Whitman.
That's
the
okay.
I think
Matthew Weiner's a better writer than that.
I think yes. Hopefully.
Are we better fans? We don't know.
Maybe we brought it. We brought it up. So
speaking of, where were you going next?
I was going to go next because one other thing I thought was interesting, and I've been obsessing about this for weeks, so obviously I had to talk about it now. Was the amount of desserts and sugar and sweetness that have been a running theme through this entire season. We'd already mentioned.
I have not been obsessed.
We'd already mentioned milkshakes. We'd already mentioned sorbet. We'd already mentioned
sherbet, orange sherbet.
We'd already mentioned. Sorry, this is a fancy pronunciation. We'd already mentioned Cool Whip. Now this week we add
Ready Whip.
Now this week we add Ready Whip directly into the mouth. Plus snowballs, plus Manischewitz, which is a sweet, sugary
thing.
Which a lot of comedians through the years have made jokes about it being
incredibly sweet kosher wine
for dessert.
Yes.
You know,
oh, really?
Yeah.
And then one more even. Julia is coming to Thanksgiving and asks Megan, what should I bring? And Megan says, something sweet. So, like, what is the...
Which I took as sweet words.
Right. Well, is it the metaphor of the sort of sugar rush that it's all of these victories that characters are winning week to week are sort of these empty sugar highs?
Well, yeah, sugar you always come down from sugar.
Right.
You know? It's always, it's pleasurable. And when you're seeking pleasure, you know, all these people are seeking pleasure and fulfillment and in their own ways, and very few of them are achieving that, even though they're achieving what from the outside world would look like success and dreams, but you know, it's like you know, if it really is, I hate to go to the metaphor thing, but, you know, if it's, if, you know, it's like a dessert, but it's empty afterward. It only lasts.
It's empty calories, or it's empty. Yeah,
right.
It's not nourishing. I felt like Betty, like, instead of eating the Ready Whip, she should have just done a little Whip It. Little nitrous, because she would have had a momentary feeling of happiness.
Instead of just stress eating, which is interesting.
And she wouldn't gain any weight from it.
She is stress eating before that was really like a thing. Like, people didn't really think about stress eating in the 60s. It's more modern idea.
Yeah, that's
and yet
true.
That's clearly what she's doing. When
and
she
also,
runs
you
into
know,
the
I just
kitchen.
thought too that in the Weight Watcher meeting, her friend says, don't feel bad. It's better to maintain than gain.
Yeah, maintaining is better than gaining.
And it's kind of, you know, that might reflect Betty's life too, as she's maintaining a life,
she is.
you know, but
That's
she's
true.
not gaining anything.
She hasn't gained. Oh, that's a good point. That's a great observation. Starley pointed out in her column, though, the Ready Whip might have been a little Sopranos nod, because I guess it was Tony's favorite late night.
Yes, that's interesting. I didn't
we know
even
Matt
think about
Weiner
that.
Tony did
Sopranos.
not go to Weight Watchers meetings.
No,
he
would not have been good there. Well, two more quick things with the sugar
prosciutto in the
that I want to bring up. The first is Don equates sugar with sin directly in the episode. That the snowballs are sinfully delicious, and the devil
Temptation.
eating
Temptation.
the devil eating the sugar.
And his temptation to Betty.
Just sort of this idea, you can't have sort of happiness and fulfillment without negative consequences. And then the last one would be Thanksgiving itself. The Thanksgiving holiday at the end is represented by two not sweet things, even though there's lots of like pumpkin pie imagery or whatever. Cranberry sauce and then a roasted Brussels sprout.
But cranberry sauce is
But it's tart. You think of
sugar.
cranberries and you think of tartness.
Yeah,
Don't
but you just
No?
put a dump. You dump it. You put like a cup of sugar in
fair
it.
enough.
Plus those like cans.
I can't.
Are full
I
of sugar.
have to bow out of this because I don't like cranberries. So.
Fair enough.
Fair
Although
enough.
I will say, I thought on Weight Watchers, you could like eat all the veggies that you wanted, and that one sad Brussels sprout. I mean, come on, like pile some more Brussels sprouts on.
A lot of people like to fade January Jones's performances on this show, and I think that the look on her face as she's eating that Brussels sprout was amazing. Was really fantastic.
Well,
she's trying to put a good face on it at first.
I think January Jones is great.
She's lovely. I think the January Jones hatred is kind of tired. I mean, me personally, I don't like it.
I find her,
backlash.
like I said, I find that Betty's such an incredibly compelling character, and it wouldn't be that way without an actress bringing it to life. You know? But I was about to say is that when Henry is eating the steak at night, it's too bad that Betty didn't know about the zone, you know.
That's right. She could have Atkins dieted her way through.
She could have eaten all the steak she wanted.
Watch out for that bread.
No potatoes and bread.
He annihilated that steak, though.
Yeah.
That was like some bachelor cooking right there. That was like.
Well, I like that scene too. It was one. It's always fascinating because everything on the show is always gray. It's never black and white.
Right.
And so even
like
as
the
they're
steak.
so even as they're dumping so much on Betty, we still see she and Henry do have a better, more healthy relationship than she and Don had.
Well, I was going to ask you about that scene because I thought she was like sort of trying on maturity, like trying it on for size.
Well,
like
she definitely is saying things she maybe doesn't believe, like, oh, it's easy to blame others, but we're in charge of ourselves.
That's why I think she's doing that self-delusion thing that you mentioned.
Right.
And it might work for her. Like that can actually, I think, cognitive therapy or whatever that comes along later, like it might actually trigger a reframing in her, or it will just fail
hard because another thing that I find interesting is that Henry seems like a very decent person, you know, in the way he hasn't been a big part of the show yet, but I find him interesting too because he works in politics and he works for John Lindsay, you know, and he worked for Nelson Rockefeller, but he's not like Don at all. He seems like he's very conservative and a decent person, and it's just interesting to me that. That Betty was unhappy with Don, who's a total rogue and totally betrayed her, and she doesn't seem that happy with Henry either, who seems like a good guy, you know.
Because it has to do with herself, I think. Like she's just like having to find it in her.
Yeah.
She wanted to have therapy that very first season, and Don.
Well, and I think that's what we're now seeing the Weight Watchers meetings, which for her is obviously sort of taking the place of that.
Like a
she was
group.
seeing the therapist, and then she was basically seeing Sally's therapist, but talking to her about her own personal stuff.
I love Sally's therapist.
And also what Weight Watchers did back then and still does, but they did it back then, and it's a very modern idea that's very prevalent to this day of like the reason you're support group, and also the reason you're overeating, the reason you have addictions is because of emotional issues. It's not just about the fact that you're hungry, you're trying to fill something up, and that was kind of ahead of its time, and that's like kind of the first inklings of the modern world of therapy that we live in now.
Maybe it will help her. I mean, maybe it will.
And to look at Weight Watchers, it was founded in 1963, so it's still pretty cutting edge in '66, and it was founded by a Brooklyn homemaker, Jean Nidetch.
Was it popular right away? Because it's huge today.
Yeah, I remember it from. I think I remember it from when I was a kid. I mean, I've heard. Seems like I've been aware of.
You've been aware of it ever since.
And obviously never partaked in it, but I've been aware of it.
And the last thing I want to say about Weight Watchers is it's the very first shot we get in this episode is actually her measuring out food. It's always about measuring exactly what you put in, and that's what all the characters are doing. This whole episode is they're measuring themselves versus everyone else around them.
The toast was pathetic.
Yeah, that was sad.
An unappetizing looking toast.
It was, yes.
So we
She could have had eggs if she knew about the zone.
She didn't know about the zone.
So we should talk about, or I don't know if it's on your list, the Ozymandias.
Oh, sure. I had Pete next on my list.
Let's do Pete.
We can jump to Ozymandias.
No, I don't want to jump.
I want to skip Pete.
All right. Well, we got to talk about Pete. Pete's sort of
important.
Pete's arc this episode largely has to do with the New York Times Sunday magazine. Here's a fascinating tidbit. I picked this up. I want to say from HitFix.
Okay.
Alan Sepinwall is the blogger on HitFix. He does a great job summing up Mad Men every week. I read it every week. He actually hunted down that this New York Times Sunday magazine feature was real. It really ran.
I just assumed that
in November '66,
when I saw it on the show,
and it profiled the partners from the agency Wells Rich Green, who were
Peter, Paul, and Mary.
They were Peter, Paul, and Mary. They were like the hip, young ad exec. I thought that was great that they were able to tie that in.
So what did you make of Pete being buddied up to by this reporter and then being cut loose? Like, was that just
Well, I
another...
think that's a thing that can happen. You know, I think, but it's interesting too when you think. The '60s, I think, in the world of advertising, is considered a golden age of incredible innovation. And you know, I grew up. There were all kinds of brilliant commercials on TV all the time. The Alka-Seltzer commercials and the Hebrew National one that I just mentioned. But I don't know if the agency on Mad Men is quite. I think they're trying to be on the cutting edge of things, but I think they're a little bit behind. And it makes sense that the New York Times wouldn't. You know, there was a lot of exciting things to write about in advertising back then, and it makes sense that Draper Sterling Price wouldn't be one of them.
Yeah, I actually think that Sterling Cooper Draper Price isn't going to make it through the series.
That's interesting.
And I thought that the Ozymandias poem was a little bit of foreshadowing of that.
Well,
and just the beginning of the beginning of this season when Pete was like, we're on the edge of failure or success.
Right,
it's one
and he's
step
seen
away.
himself too as he's got to be. He's the savior. He's the one that's getting all the new accounts. That's going to turn everything around.
I think that there's because they have these dinosaurs now, and unless they. You know, just let the young people take over. Although we were talking about the Pete New York Times thing, I wanted to mention that funny moment when he said, yeah, they're doing a profile on hip agencies, and
Bert Cooper says hep. Yes, I was talking about this on Twitter last night with somebody.
Because that's an older term.
Yeah, that's
Cooper's
like
correcting
jazz
Pete,
era.
but using the old form. And if you use the word hep in '66, it labeled you as not.
Yes, and in the movie. In the movie Sweet Smell of Success, which is in many ways a precursor to Mad Men, Burt Lancaster's character is talking to the senator. As any hep cat knows, she is walking around. He is walking around carrying her. So hep was like 1955.
You'd like stick out like
it brings to mind beatniks.
Yeah, it's like if you said in 1966, so that kid is a beat, and probably people were still saying that, but beatniks were over by then. You know?
I love that we got our first J.J. Hunsaker quote here on This Week in Mad Men. That makes me feel good. That was Lancaster's character from Sweet Smell of Success. Wanted to
catch up on that.
Yeah. Oh, have you seen that movie?
I haven't.
It's a great movie.
It's one of the great screenplays,
Okay.
I would say, maybe of all time.
Maybe it's on Netflix.
But yeah, I love that. I love that moment because it was not only that Cooper's out of step, which is obvious. I mean, he's so old at this point, and he's been portrayed as sort of the dotty old man for a little while. But that he had the brazenness to think, I'm going to correct Pete about this term.
It was just a funny moment too.
Yeah.
But they all like hate Pete now. Everyone's against Pete.
Well, because Pete brings that on himself by being constantly insisting on, I deserve more credit, I deserve more accolades, you guys should respect me more. You don't, nobody likes somebody like that.
I mean, to me, it's like
stuff going on.
One of the things that's great about the show is, Pete from day one, just struck me as a total douchebag. And I still think he's a douchebag, but he's a more multi-layered douchebag now.
You really, in my opinion, though, just his family history and everything that they've done to sort of color his character has given me a lot of empathy toward him in a way. Like his dad was so cold and and he just was so removed from that family. I did like too when Sterling was like, I hope you didn't start with the Mayflower. I hope you didn't mention the Mayflower.
Right, give him back some background or whatever.
And also when you talk about resentment, this was on a previous episode, but Pete's resentment towards Don is overwhelming. And when he said it a few times in the course of the series, Don Draper just walks in, it all just comes so easily to him. He takes what he wants, he doesn't worry about the consequences, and he just is so resentful towards Don. Although he protected him in the past,
Well, Don did him a solid because he ponied up the money for the...
Right, yeah.
But was that really for Pete? Or was it for the company?
Well, I think
you could look at motives.
So before we move on from Pete, we have to talk about the sex fantasy he has. He's laying on, again, I was talking about miserable people in beautiful settings. He's reclining on this couch in his office, and he's imagining, and it's such a Pete sex fantasy, because she comes in and she doesn't, first of all, he's being incredibly nerdy about it, even in his own mind. He's like, you can't be here and fumbling with this. Even in his own mind, he's not slick. And then he's fantasizing about she forgot about him, but then she read about him in the New York Times Sunday magazine, and now she's interested in him.
Right, he's like a Don or something.
Well, so it's not an erotic fantasy. I mean, she's half undressed, but it's about recognition.
Ego.
But I talk about him being a douchebag, but that's a moment I think in a way I kind of relate to him in a way, and I've in the past thought, you know what, if I got written about in the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker,
beautiful women would
be
Alexis
all
Bledel
they'll be all over me.
Would be coming in.
Chubby Werewolf mentioned on Twitter how that was very Dark Shadows. Just the whole influence of Dark Shadows.
Oh, was it?
The
really?
series,
I never saw it.
Dark Shadows, I never saw it either. But now the Johnny Depp movie is out. We can go see the satirical version.
Okay, as long as we're going to jump into Dark Shadows, can I just say, there's no way they could have possibly planned this or lined it up. But how amazing is it that they have
the same week
Dark Shadows themed episode
the same week,
and the same week that the remake with Johnny Depp is opening.
But Matt Weiner probably could have planned.
I don't see how. I mean, he would have had no way out. The only other possibility I can think of is it was a different show, and maybe they flipped it to Dark Shadows when they discovered. Because you'd only have to replace that one scene and the title. Because really only that one scene would actually talk about it.
Not if they were influenced by that style in that.
It does. No, it does seem. It does seem like Dark Shadows, and we'll jump in. We'll jump in and talk about it. It had debuted in 1966 in June, so it wasn't really a cult hit yet, but it was on the air. Interestingly enough, though the show now is completely associated with the Barnabas Collins vampire character, he was not introduced until 1967. So it was not a supernatural soap opera.
Yeah, I read that recently because there have been a lot of articles about it.
Yeah, which I did not even know.
Dan Curtis, the guy who created it, just threw that in eventually. It wasn't getting good ratings. And
what if it goes down?
Yeah. I did not actually.
And then it worked.
I didn't actually realize that. And they say, even in the lines that Megan and Julie are reading, they mentioned Mr. Collins, which you think is Barnabas Collins, but Roger Collins would have been a regular character even early on. So it could have been a different Mr. Collins. I do want to talk about, because even though I sort of joked about maybe they could have flipped in a different show, Chubby Werewolf's already calling me out about it in the room. There was a lot of Dark Shadows and soap opera imagery in the actual episode.
Right.
So let's take a look at here's the opening credit sequence from the original 1966 Dark Shadows. Then we'll chat a little about it.
Nobody hangs up a thing around here.
I'd like to see Mrs. Stoddard, if you'd be so kind.
Mrs. Stoddard?
This is Collinwood, isn't it?
Yes.
And the mistress here is Mrs. Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, is she not?
Yes.
Then perhaps you'd do me the courtesy to inform Mrs. Stoddard that her cousin is calling and wishes to pay his respects.
Her cousin?
Yes, her cousin from England.
From England? Oh, please, come in.
I'd be delighted, thank you.
Oh, would you like to wait in the drawing room?
Here would be fine, thank you.
Oh, well, I'll let Mrs. Stoddard know you're here.
Oh, madam, if you would, you may tell her that it's Barnabas Collins.
So, you know,
Barnabas.
this obviously is referenced in the show when Julia and Megan are running lines from it and sort of discussing it. And I think also definitely like fog and smoke imagery was very prevalent in Dark Shadows, and the killer smog of New York obviously links up to that and is a dark shadow in of itself.
I don't remember killer smogs from when I was a kid.
I looked it up. It's actually hard to find info about
I know
this
L.A.
incident.
was known for its smog back in those days.
Well, we could talk
but
about it a little more.
I don't doubt that they
169 people in New York actually did die on Thanksgiving weekend from this weird smog that they don't really understand exactly how it happened. But I do want just to get back to
they weren't
Dark
strong
Shadows.
like me. I survived.
You survived it.
Hardy. So obviously, you know, we have vampire imagery with Dark Shadows, which I think you could link up to Don maybe in this episode, where he's sort of leeching off of Mike's ideas and taking sort of Mike and Megan's youth. He's sort of trying to almost drain that from them in a way, and Roger as well being sort of metaphorically sucked dry. I think you could link up in some ways to it. And also, I wanted to talk about just the melodramatic approach to storytelling in this week's show, especially the Sally scenes, where Sally's attacking Megan and then Sally facing off with Don. She brings this very heightened sort of performance to it this week.
That face-off to me was very Shakespearean in the way it was staged with the different levels, and they had her on the upper level and him on the lower level. That was very popular way of staging Shakespeare with the tri-levels, and they have the three in the sunken living room, which they've used several times.
Well, they have that sunken living room now, so they can have those kind of
they've used it. I mean, throughout this whole season.
And a lot of Shakespeare's plays take place in cool Manhattan apartments.
They really do, yeah.
A lot of like hip reimaginings take place. Hip reimaginings. Excuse me. Sorry.
Merchant of Venice, you know.
And
Merchant of Manhattan.
We talked last week about, or 2 weeks ago, about like postmodernism's creeping into Mad Men and how the show itself seems to be getting more meta as it goes along. And so I thought this could also be, naming their episode after famous soap opera, could be like a tip of the cap to inevitably a series that's lasted this long gets soapy, and some of the relationships get a little soapy.
I know a lot of people were really psyched about the meta stuff that was going on, but for me, I was really tuned into the emotional part.
When I watch Mad Men doesn't strike me as that meta when I watch it. It has references to shows from that era, which I love. You know, but it doesn't ever feel to me like it's commenting on itself.
Yeah, and the meta
stuff
it definitely
always was in the Beatles episode, because where they made a big deal about we can't use Beatles songs, it's too expensive to use Beatles songs, and then end with Tomorrow Never Knows.
Okay.
Yeah, see, they're always on top of the meta stuff. I'm always into the emotional drama, but that's why we make a good panel, though, because we all have that to bring.
And just as a final thought on Dark Shadows,
it is interesting when it's pointed out. I mean, like,
I have been bringing up one other show repeatedly throughout this season of Mad Men.
Smash.
Yes, of course, but just because I'm such a huge fan, and I just want to talk about
season finale is tonight.
What are we doing here? Let's go.
No.
Twin Peaks is the other show that I've caught references to.
Which has the ominous sort of stuff.
A gothic soap opera. That's what Twin Peaks was.
And they had the actress. He pointed out how
Maud Shinamick, who was the woman that Don strangled, was Shelley Johnson from Twin Peaks.
Okay.
And Ray Wise, who was Laura Palmer's father, Leland Palmer, also in this season of Mad Men.
He's Ken's father-in-law.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I forget the character's name.
I forget the
now.
character's
He was Ed something.
Maybe, yeah, but yeah.
All right,
Little
anyway.
Twin Peaks fan,
just
bringing his Twin
working
Peaks knowledge
it back.
in.
I mean, if I have like 3 or 4 different episodes now, I've had cause to reference Twin Peaks on the show, which is significant, I think, in some way. And now they're bringing in another Gothic soap opera from this time.
Yeah.
I thought it merited mentioning.
The symbol. So now are we moving on to Ozymandias?
I was going to do Killer Smog and then Ozymandias, but we can do Ozymandias.
Oh, I'm pushing
Keep
you
pushing
ahead.
Ozymandias.
I thought Ozymandias came after Pete.
Well, Ozymandias, we'll do Ozymandias. What the hell? We're on it. Mike, at one point, sort of memorably, he's showing off his own work, and he sarcastically quips, "Look on my works, ye mighty in despair." And then Stan says you should read the rest of that poem. And of course, the reference is Percy Shelley's sonnet, Ozymandias. I actually have a clip. It's not a clip, it's the entire poem being read because it's only 14 lines.
Just a sonnet.
So let's take a quick look.
Don't tune out, folks.
Don't tune out.
It's a poem,
It's a
but it's
minute
only
of poetry.
short.
Take a look. It's got pictures, so you can watch it. Here is a reading of Ozymandias.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
Oh, come on. That was way longer than you said it was going to be.
God, liar. It had this really ominous. Oh, I found like 3 versions of the poem being read on YouTube, and they all had the creepy narration like that.
I didn't know that Freddy Krueger did poetry readings.
I was saying it sounded like
surprising.
Don's performance as Satan reading it.
Yeah, it was like, even me, Ozymandias. My name is Ozymandias.
So yeah, I mean, as you were sort of already saying, I think the basic tie-in of the theme is basically what Stan says, that you're gonna boast, you're gonna be so proud of your work, and it's just nothing lasts, and all these great achievements are gonna crumble.
What I always thought was interesting reading about it is the episode opens where they talk about competition, and they're clearly in competition with these other ad agencies trying to get in the New York Times piece, and this particular sonnet was written because of a competition.
That's right.
Between Shelley and another poet.
And what was the message of the poem, or the
It's he sees this, sort of like once great statue of Ozymandias, and now it's crumbled, just like in the video.
It's in ruins.
It's in ruins, and then there's a little that "Look upon my works, ye mighty in despair" is written on a little plaque. So he's just reflecting on this guy thought this was going to last forever, and it was his permanent monument to his greatness, and it's all collapsed and ruined.
Yeah,
now.
my prediction is that is Sterling Cooper or Draper Price, but that doesn't. You guys, what did you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's in some ways it's everybody, and I mean it's just kind of pointing out what all these characters are discovering, and what we've even talked about before is that this season has largely been people sort of they got what they want, or they're getting what they want, and then they discover, well, now I've got what I wanted, and it's not really what they wanted, and it's not this you don't get to succeed and then you're permanently happy forever and that's it. You don't marry the girl and then, well, now you're blissfully together and that's the end of your story. It just goes on, and it's not maybe what you had sort of thought. And I thought also this episode in particular was pointing out how temporary a lot of these victories are. That Don won over Ginsberg. He leaves his drawings in the car. It's hardly a permanent solution to the Ginsberg problem.
Oh God, no. I think that.
And Ginsberg even points out, I got thousands of ideas.
The fact that he sold that pitch and he was like, we sold it, that's all that matters. That was just a lucky bat, in my opinion, because eventually people aren't going to want those types of ideas. They're going to want the Ginsberg types of ideas.
Well, it was, the thing that's disturbing is it was unprofessional of Don to do that.
Yeah.
It was like, and like I said before, in previous years, he always seems like at the top of his game in the office.
It was so small.
And here he is doing something small, and
so small.
And that if, you know, what if they hadn't liked his idea, and maybe they could have liked the other idea.
Yeah.
And I read someone on, I think in Salon, the woman who wrote about Mad Men, said that Don says, I hate going into a pitch with two ideas, and then this person pointed out that, you know, he always has two of everything, you know, two wives.
He always has a backup.
In the drawer. Two,
you know, it's like for him to say that, it's coming from the wrong.
Plus, we've seen him pull out other ideas in the moment when something's failing in the room, you know?
Oh, Barney Barn has an excellent comment in the chat room. He has two names. He even has,
that's
a
right.
backup name.
Yeah.
Good point.
That's an excellent point.
Good chat room.
Good job. And also other temporary things. Betty's looks. That's what she's dealing with now. Is she had prized her looks, and that's how she sort of valued herself. And she was this beautiful, glamorous woman.
She's not a skinny person
and now
anymore.
she's feeling like she's lost that. She's looking at Megan, who now has that, and she doesn't. And even in a minor way, Henry, who had his sort of shot at glory, but now Lindsay doesn't want to run, and it's like, oh, if I had been on the Rockefeller campaign, we could have been running for president.
Yeah,
Lindsay
that was
doesn't want
interesting
to
to me because I followed New York politics very closely back then, and Lindsay actually lived right across the street from our Gracie Mansion was right across the street.
Oh, wow.
I used to see him, and I used to see his kid and stuff.
Cool.
And but I know there was a bit of a movement to draft Lindsay in the Republican convention in 1968, but it seems like a guy like Henry, who's a smart political operator, would know how unlikely that would be. You know?
Yeah.
And that he would.
I saw somebody else was talking about
that. He would place his bets on Lindsay running. Lindsay had only been mayor since 1965, so the idea that he would run in 1968 for president, I think would have. There was talk of it, but a real political professional, I think, would have treated that as the far-fetched thing and wouldn't join John Lindsay with the idea that, oh, then I'll be in the White House after 1968.
Yeah. Now, who did Henry work for last year?
Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York.
He's sort of thinking Nelson Rockefeller's got a clear shot at a future political career.
Right, and in 68,
I backed the wrong guy.
That's
is what
right.
He says, yeah.
Okay.
And you know, Rockefeller, you know, he ended up just becoming an appointed vice president with Gerald Ford, but. And it's interesting, John Lindsay did run in 1972, but he ran as a Democrat, and he was quickly defeated in the primaries.
Were Republican and Democrat the same back then?
Well, there was a thing back then, and Henry is a political thing that doesn't exist anymore. He's a moderate Republican.
Yeah.
He supports and also the Robert Morse character,
Bert Cooper.
Bert Cooper mentions, I was at the Javits benefit, which is Jacob Javits, who was the senator in New York at that time. Also a moderate, John Lindsay, Jacob Javits, and Rockefeller all ran as Republicans and liberals.
Oh, really?
They ran on the Republican line and the liberal line. And that's something you never see anymore.
Yeah.
I've been to the Javits Convention Center.
Oh, yeah.
So we're running really low on time, but a couple more things, two more things I want to work in before we go.
Yes, let's work them in.
The Killer Smog, I think we have to talk about it. It was November 24th, 1966. Believe that it may be, and here's what I thought was interesting. A lot of people believe that what happened is what's called a temperature inversion, which is that because of an odd mix of heat usually rises and heat gets trapped under a big cold front, and it can trap all the air in an area and makes it become very still and it stops circulating.
Ew, it's like the valley.
So it is. So pollutants gather and they don't disperse. It's what happens in Mexico City a lot because it's got this.
Broadway turned into Ventura Boulevard.
Yeah, and probably back then the types of regulations they had on.
They hadn't had the regulations yet back then.
So I thought that idea reminded me a lot of what they say to Betty in the Weight Watchers meeting. We mentioned already. It's about maintaining. That's what. It's not circulating. It's not changing. It's not moving. It's just stagnant. And that stagnant is what's made the city toxic. And in some ways, maybe you could say that that's what's
Yeah,
a lot
and
of
then
these characters are
you
feeling
know,
stagnated.
Yeah, Megan, Dawn comes out, oh, it's so hot in here, and she's like, don't open the window.
Right.
You know,
well,
your suffocating life is going to stay suffocating.
and
Sorry.
I also thought, yeah, that was the other thing I was thinking.
Don't
was,
worry, the toxicity will come through with
Yeah.
Betty. Or
well,
the-
right. That's exactly where I was
Yeah.
going to go. Is that she at an earlier part of the episode she says Betty's trying to poison them from 50 miles away.
Right.
She uses that exact word, poison.
Yeah.
And then
Or
that's
I
what,
think she even said, like, throw a poison bomb or something.
yeah, she's trying to poison us from 50 miles, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then of course you got to keep the windows
Yeah.
sealed tight because the air is poisonous, and so it's really just trying to keep that poison out. And I think the implication would be it's Don. Don
So then
is
the
bringing
question
it
is,
in.
will Don escape his past? Will he?
I think
Yeah.
that
Can he?
that to me was
For
a
this relationship?
pretty strong piece of foreshadowing that no, something about Don's past, something about Don's personality is toxic, and it's going to bring that toxicity
But I don't
into
know if
their
necessarily if Don's secret, which was a big deal in earlier seasons, like, I don't know if
It
that's...
feels diffused.
Yeah, I don't know
Yeah, I
if
don't know if
that's
it's that.
necessarily going to come to haunt him. He had some
it's
very
not-
haunting things earlier where his half-brother or his brother came
Yeah.
and then he committed suicide.
Yeah, the suicide, right.
And I think that it's Don's future that's that's going to be the problem for him. I think he's heading into the late he's heading into middle age, and he's heading into the mid 60s, which is all the 60s have already started. What we know as the 60s, not just the decade. And as it becomes 67, 68, 69, the world is going to change even crazier. And I think he's going to have a really hard
He
time
will not be able to adjust.
maneuvering through that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
You know, whereas Ginsberg and Peggy, I think, you know,
They're going to embrace it. I
they're,
think.
you know,
Yeah.
Peggy already has been hanging out with like the kind of cool Andy Warhol crowd, and
Yeah.
she goes down to the Village, and it's like a whole world that like Pete Campbell and those, so they know nothing of that world,
Right.
you know. But Peggy is and with her boyfriend too, who's kind of fancies himself
Yeah.
an incendiary.
Well, she
journalist.
met Abe, if you remember back, she met
Yeah.
him at that crazy art party in the Village.
Yeah.
And they
There
got
was like
locked in
a
the closet
bomb
together.
scare or something.
yeah.
Or no, it was a raid. It was a
It was
police
a raid, right. It was a raid. They were hiding
Yeah.
for the raid. Real quick things before I get to the last note about the closing song. We also have to talk about the closing song. We've been talking a lot about other TV, like recognizable faces from TV history popping up this season. I loved, as Max Rosenberg, the Manischewitz guy, Richard Fancy, who I, of course, remember as Mr. Littman from Seinfeld. Weird looking at him not running Top of the Muffin to you anymore. He was
okay.
Elaine's boss at Pendant
it.
Publishing. Another one was the clothes, and they've been talking about Megan's sort of orange outfit in the chat room, but there were a lot of scenes with Don, especially in not suits, and we're so used to seeing him in suits. There were a lot of scenes of him in his jammies, two different sequences.
We saw him on a Saturday. Going
Two
to
different
office.
sequences with him in his PJs. And then in the office, he was in a green sweater. It's maybe the first time I think we've ever seen him in
Well,
a
there was
meeting.
the
But
meeting.
he's holding a meeting, and he's in that green sweater. It may have been an
Yeah.
off hours, but still,
Thanksgiving week, I
it's a
guess.
little bit of a culture shock to see him dressed down like
Yeah.
that. I thought that was an
That
interesting
might
thing.
be Megan's influence.
I think
on
Megan
it.
buys
That's-
them
yes.
stuff. She bought him that jacket for the country.
Or the other thought I had was
Remember?
this was an episode where we're remembering Anna Draper, and of course she would bring out the more casual, loose California Don / Dick Whitman.
Yeah.
Perhaps this was a connection there, that he's a little more casual when he's thinking about her. What was the last thing?
The song?
We'll talk about the song.
Oh.
There was one more, but forget it. We're running too late. So the closing song, this time it was called Sweeping the Clouds Away by Maurice Chevalier. He's known for Thank Heaven for Little Girls in this country primarily, but that was not the song they used. It's a Depression-era song about optimism in the face of hard times.
Do you know who wrote that song?
I don't, but I have
interested
internet
to
here,
know.
so I can find out.
During the clip.
Well, I'll look it up during the clip. So let's play a little clip from the song Sweeping the Clouds Away.
Don't go around moping, hoping happiness will come. That's not the way. It doesn't pay. If you want happiness, just help yourself to some. Why don't you try to take life the way I do? Let the whole world sigh or cry. I'll be high in the sky, up on top of a rainbow.
Sam Coslow was the songwriter on that. Maurice Chevalier singing. So, I mean, what was there's one line that I pulled out of it, but I'd like to hear, before I jump in there, what was the significance of this song? It's not of the time period. It's an earlier song. What do you think? Why an optimistic Depression era anthem?
Well, I wasn't thinking about it being significant in terms of the time period, but more of just the content and the lyrics of finding happiness and making happiness your own. Because to me, the whole episode was about how we are responsible for our own happiness. Just like Roger's saying, it's every man for himself.
Sure.
Emotionally, it's every man for himself. And but maybe there was some significance in terms of the time period. I didn't go there, so I didn't explore that.
I mean, there was one part of the song I pulled out, just the lyrics. I have learned life's lesson. Fighters who always win are those who can take it right on the chin and grin. Just seems kind of Mad Men portentous to me. So maybe sort of speaking to this episode's focus on competition, that the people who can compete, lose, rebound are going to do better than the people like maybe Pete Campbell, who get defeated and it just is devastating.
And Betty,
then they
who's
can't.
still hung up on her divorce. I mean, my God, she's not taking it in the chin and grinning.
Right, and I mean, even like, instead of seeing Megan's body and being in Weight Watchers and having that be a motivator, it seems to have just sort of destroyed her will, and she's still trying.
Almost,
but
I think she's jealous that not just of Megan's looks, but I think she's still bruised by Don not loving her anymore.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, it's all about coveting the life that he has with this woman. It's
and
not,
also, I think it's indicative of that era too, in that a life that wasn't available to Betty Draper in 1959 would have been available to her in 1966, or at least
if
the dawning of that.
If she hadn't done the kids and everything.
Or even, you know, she sees Megan in a domestic situation with Don, but still kind of living what would seem to Betty like a fun
freedom.
And that freedom, and I think that's going to be a real dynamic as the show continues. And I think that's part of why I think it wasn't just seeing Megan, it was seeing the apartment too. You know, compare that apartment to that like mausoleum that they live in Westchester or whatever.
To me, it was like everything that was going through her head in that apartment walkthrough was, we could have had this. We could have had this life. Why didn't he give me this life?
Well, and I think an interesting thing too is the note, reading the note, and how sort of sweet
how romantic
he's being.
it was.
And it's giving her this vision of their marriage that, you know, maybe it's true.
He treated her.
Maybe it's not true. Don's a good writer, and that sort of reminds us of how well written that note was. And then later, we do see a note that Megan wrote Don, and it's just real quick, went to get bagels.
Yeah.
It's not sweet like that. So I think there's the idea that from outside, just like Howard said, that the grass being greener, Betty's got this fake image of what that apartment and that life is like. It's not really accurate. She doesn't know. And
she doesn't quite understand it either.
Right, the complexity of that their relationship is complex and troubled in similar way. Maybe not as bad.
Betty too is like a golden girl, you know. She's like this beautiful young, and in the 50s, everyone in the world would have envied her, and she just came into New York and she was beautiful, and she met this successful, handsome man, and they had kids, and they had a house in the suburbs, and you know, and that's all kind of it all just went to hell.
Well, it was Ozymandias, just like in the poem. It's crumbled and it's nothing but ruins now, even though it seemed like it was going to last forever. They're also pointing out in the chat room that we're being very metaphorical, and there is a literal like, well, it's smoggy. There's lots of clouds, and now we're playing the song about sweeping clouds away, which is I'm just trying to go so high level it didn't even occur to me
but
that there actually are clouds. Well, it looks like a big cloud. I think they're right about that.
Okay.
Anyway,
I trust the chat room.
anything else? Anything to wrap up? Anybody? I think we've covered a lot of ground. I guess not. So thanks so much for joining us, all of you out there, and thank you so much to Janie, of course, as always, and Frank Conniff for joining us. At Frank Conniff on Twitter, look him up. CinematicTitanic.com.
Yes,
people can go check
out.
We should mention our show, the
the
David Feldman
show.
David Feldman show that we do.
Where can I listen to that?
You can find it on iTunes, or you can go to David Feldman's website and David Feldman Comedy.
Right, or if you live in LA, you can listen to it at 2:30 on Fridays
on Pacifica.
KPCK.
Pacifica Radio.
And also, I'd like to add, I'm doing Mondays and Fridays, I'm doing videos for Salon.com. So
Oh,
Oh yeah, I saw
fantastic.
your latest one. That was good.
Go to salon.com, check it out. Thank
Just
you so
follow
much for
Frank
being here.
on Twitter. Just follow
yeah,
Frank
follow him
on-
on Twitter. You'll
Yeah.
catch all the stuff. Thank you so much. Come back anytime. It was a delight to have
Thank you.
And thank you all, and we will see you next week on another episode of This Week in Mad Men.